The storm had been building for hours, dark clouds gathering over the mountain peaks like an ominous prophecy waiting to unfold. Isla stood at the window of her small cabin, watching as lightning split the sky in jagged silver lines, illuminating the dense forest that surrounded her isolated home. She had lived here alone for 5 years now, ever since the night her world had burned to ashes, ever since the night the Northern Kingdom's forces had swept through her clan's territory and left. Nothing but corpses and ruins behind. The memories still haunted her dreams, the screams of her family echoing through her mind in the quiet moments before dawn. But she had learned to survive in solitude, to find purpose in her healing work, even when everything else had been stripped away from her. The wind howled against the wooden walls of her cabin, rattling the shutters with violent force as the storm finally broke overhead. Rain came down in torrential sheets, transforming the forest floor into a muddy river within minutes. Isla turned away from the window and moved toward her fireplace, adding another log to keep the flames burning strong against the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. She had gathered her herbs earlier in the day, sensing the storm's approach, and now they hung in bundled clusters from the ceiling beams, filling the small space with their earthy, medicinal scent. This was her sanctuary, the only place in the world where she felt remotely safe, where she could practice her healing arts without fear of persecution or discovery. But tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the storm's fury, a prickling awareness along her skin that made her wolf restless beneath the surface. Isla pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat accelerate without understanding why. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years of living alone, and right now every instinct was screaming that something significant was about to happen, that the careful isolation she had built around herself was about to be shattered in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The crash came just after midnight, a sound that cut through even the storm's rage. Isla's head snapped toward the door, her enhanced hearing picking up something that didn't belong to the natural chaos of wind and rain. It was the sound of breaking branches, of something heavy falling, of a pained grunt that was distinctly human or perhaps wolf. Without thinking, she grabbed her cloak and her healing satchel, throwing both on as she rushed toward the door. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was foolish, that going out into the storm to investigate unknown sounds was the kind of mistake that got lone wolves killed. But her healer's instinct was stronger than her fear. Someone was hurt out there, possibly dying, and she had spent too many years watching people die to ignore that sound now. The moment she stepped outside, the storm hit her with physical force. Rain lashed against her face, immediately soaking through her cloak despite its thickness. The wind tried to push her back toward the cabin, as if nature itself was warning her to stay inside, to remain safe in her isolation. But Isla pushed forward, following the sound she had heard, her feet finding purchase on the slippery ground through years of familiarity with this terrain. She knew every rock and root in this forest, had walked these paths in all seasons and all weather, and that knowledge served her now as she made her way toward the source of the disturbance. She found him collapsed at the base of a massive oak tree, his body crumpled in a way that spoke of violent impact and serious injury. Lightning flashed overhead, and in that brief illumination, Isla saw blood, saw the torn fabric of expensive clothing, saw the kind of muscular build that belonged to a warrior rather than a wanderer. He was face down in the mud, unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of his shoulders that indicated he was still breathing, still clinging to life despite whatever had brought him to this state. Isla dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to assess his injuries, even as rain continued to pour down on them both. He was burning with fever despite the cold rain, his skin radiating heat that suggested infection, or perhaps the beginning stages of a rejected shift. Isla's fingers found a deep gash along his ribs, the kind of wound that could only come from silver weapons, and her heart clenched with both sympathy and wariness. Silver weapons meant hunters or pack enforcers, meant someone had been trying to kill this man specifically, had wanted him dead with the kind of certainty that came from using the one metal that could truly harm their kind. She should leave him here, should walk away and let nature take its course. because anyone being hunted with silver was dangerous, was likely a threat to her carefully maintained anonymity and safety. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Isla was already working to shift his weight, already calculating how to move someone easily twice her size back to her cabin. The healer in her couldn't abandon someone in need, no matter how logical the cautionary voice in her head might be. She managed to get him onto his back, and another flash of lightning revealed his face. He was handsome in a harsh, angular way, with strong features that spoke of authority and power, with dark hair plastered to his skull by rain and mud. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of her memory, but she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the immediate problem of getting him to shelter before they both died of exposure. It took nearly an hour to drag him back to her cabin, her muscles screaming with the effort, her lungs burning as she fought against the storm and his considerable weight. By the time she finally got him through her door and onto the floor near the fireplace, Isla was shaking with exhaustion, her clothes completely soaked, her hair hanging in wet ropes around her face. But there was no time to rest, no time to catch her breath, because her patient was deteriorating rapidly. She stripped off her wet cloak and immediately went to work, building up the fire to provide warmth and light, gathering her supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. The wound along his ribs was worse than she had initially thought, deep and ragged, with traces of silver still embedded in the flesh. Isla worked methodically to clean it, using her specialized tools to extract every fragment of the poisonous metal, knowing that even the smallest piece left behind could kill him. His fever spiked higher as she worked, his body fighting against the silver's toxicity, and she had to use every bit of her healing knowledge to stabilize him. She applied poultices made from rare mountain herbs, the same healing techniques that had been passed down through her bloodline for generations, the same gifts that had made her clan valuable enough to be seen as a threat worth eliminating. As she worked, Isla found herself studying his features more closely. There was something about the set of his jaw, the aristocratic line of his nose, the way power seemed to radiate from him even in unconsciousness that spoke of high rank, of someone accustomed to command and authority. His hands bore the calluses of a warrior, but also showed signs of careful grooming, suggesting wealth and status. The clothing she had cut away from his wounds was made of fine materials, despite being torn and bloodied, the kind of quality that belonged to pack leaders or nobility. Whoever this man was, he was important, and that made her decision to help him either the most compassionate or the most foolish thing she had ever done. The storm raged on through the night as Isla fought to keep her mysterious patient alive. She monitored his fever, changed his bandages, forced healing tinctures between his lips when his body would accept them. Several times he came close to the edge, his breathing growing shallow and irregular, his heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. And each time Isla pulled him back with a combination of medicine, magic, and sheer stubborn determination. She had lost too many people already, had watched her entire family die, while she hid in a cellar like a coward, and something in her refused to let this stranger become another ghost to haunt her nightmares. As dawn finally broke, and the storm began to subside, the man's fever broke as well. His breathing evened out, becoming deep and regular, and the deadly pallor began to fade from his skin. Isla sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cabin's chill, feeling the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had spent the entire night fighting death itself. She had done it, though, had managed to save him against considerable odds, and now she would have to deal with the consequences of that choice when he eventually woke up, and she discovered who exactly she had invited into her sanctuary. She allowed herself a few hours of rest, curled up in her chair near the fire, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, keeping one eye on her patient even in sleep. When she woke, the afternoon sun was streaming through her windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind that crystalline clarity of air that only came after violent weather, and her patient was awake, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Isla found herself unable to look away from those eyes, found herself caught in a gaze that seemed to see straight through every defense she had carefully constructed over the past 5 years. There was recognition there, she realized with a jolt. Recognition and something else. Something that made her wolf surge forward with an eagerness she didn't understand. The air between them seemed to shimmer with energy, with a connection that defied logic or explanation. And Isla felt her carefully ordered world tilt on its axis in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The man tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his ribs, and Isla was immediately on her feet and moving toward him with professional concern overriding her personal confusion. She pressed him back down gently but firmly, her hands on his shoulders feeling the heat of his skin through the thin blanket she had covered him with. He was still too weak to resist, though she could sense the frustration in him, the kind of irritation that came from someone unused to being vulnerable or dependent on others. She retrieved a cup of water and helped him drink, supporting his head with one hand while he swallowed gratefully, and even that simple act felt charged with an intimacy that made her uncomfortable. He thanked her in a voice that was rough from disuse, asking where he was and how he had gotten here. Isla explained about finding him in the storm, about the silver poisoning, about how close he had come to death. She kept her answers brief and clinical, not offering more information than necessary, not asking the questions that burned in her mind about who he was and what had happened to him. He told her his name was Kyle, just Kyle, and she didn't press for more, despite knowing that such omission usually indicated someone with something to hide. She introduced herself simply as Isla, a healer who lived alone in the mountains, and saw the flicker of interest in his eyes at that description, though he didn't pursue it further. Over the next few days, as Kale slowly regained his strength, Isla found herself drawn into conversations that went far deeper than simple patient and healer interactions. He was intelligent and articulate, with a way of looking at the world that challenged her assumptions and made her think about things from perspectives she had never considered. They talked about pack politics and the corrupting nature of power, about the responsibilities of leadership and the price of making difficult decisions, about justice and mercy, and whether redemption was ever truly possible for those who had committed terrible acts. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about Isla's decision to help a stranger during the storm, and don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Kyle spoke about these topics with the authority of someone who had lived them, who had grappled with impossible choices and borne the weight of consequences. Isla found herself opening up in return, sharing thoughts and feelings she had kept, buried for years, finding in this stranger a kind of understanding she had thought lost forever. She was careful not to reveal too much about her past, about the clan she had lost, but she spoke of loneliness and survival, of finding purpose in healing when everything else had been taken away, of the daily choice to continue living when grief made existence feel unbearable. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the small cabin, and Isla would feel that strange pull again, that sense of connection that went beyond rational explanation. Her wolf recognized something in him, yearned toward him in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. She had heard stories of true mates, of the destined bonds that transcended pack politics and personal history, but she had never expected to experience it herself, had certainly never imagined it might happen with a wounded stranger she had pulled from a storm. Yet every day that passed made the connection stronger, made it harder to deny that something significant was happening between them, something that had the power to change everything she thought she knew about her future. Kale seemed to feel it too, though he fought against it in ways she could observe if not understand. There was conflict in his eyes sometimes when he looked at her, a war between desire and duty, between what he felt and what he believed he should feel. He would start to reach for her hand and then pull back, would begin to say something personal, and then redirect the conversation to safer topics. Isla understood the hesitation, shared it herself, because allowing this connection to deepen meant vulnerability, meant risking the kind of pain that came from caring about someone in a world where loss was always inevitable. On the 5th night, as they sat together by the fire after dinner, Kale finally began to tell her more about himself. He spoke of a kingdom he served, of responsibilities that weighed on him like physical burdens, of decisions he had made that haunted him in the quiet hours before dawn. He talked about a council that advised him, about the pressure to maintain strength and order in a world that seemed constantly on the edge of chaos. He described feeling trapped by duty, by the expectations of his position, by the fear that showing any weakness or compassion would be interpreted as failure by those who looked to him for leadership. Isla listened carefully, hearing the pain beneath his words, recognizing the isolation that came from standing at the top of a hierarchy with no one to truly confide in. She shared her own experiences of loneliness, of the peculiar ache that came from being surrounded by silence day after day, of wondering if she would ever feel truly connected to another person again. As she spoke, Kale moved closer, and she didn't pull away. When his hand finally covered hers, the touch sent electricity racing up her arm, made her heart stutter in her chest. She looked up to find him, watching her with an expression of such raw longing that it stole her breath, and when he leaned in to kiss her, she met him halfway without hesitation or doubt. The kiss shattered something between them, broke down the last walls they had been maintaining. Kyle pulled her into his arms, and Isla went willingly, feeling safer and more right than she had in 5 long years. They made love slowly and carefully, mindful of his healing injuries, but driven by a need that transcended physical desire. It was a claiming and a surrender, a recognition of the bond that had been growing between them since that first moment their eyes had met. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms before the dying fire, Isla felt something she had thought lost forever. She felt hope, felt the possibility of a future that contained more than just survival and solitude. The next morning brought reality crashing back in the worst possible way. Isla woke early and decided to wash the clothes Kale had been wearing. When she found him, the fine garments she had carefully set aside while nursing him back to health. As she went through the pockets to ensure they were empty before washing, her fingers closed around a small leather wallet. She shouldn't have opened it, should have simply set it aside and respected his privacy, but something compelled her to look inside. What she found made her blood run cold, and her hands start to shake. Inside the wallet was an official seal, a mark of authority that she recognized immediately because it had been burned into her memory 5 years ago. It was the royal crest of the Northern Kingdom, the symbol carried only by the Alpha King himself, or those acting with his direct authority, and beneath it was a small portrait, a formal image that showed Kale dressed in royal regalia, his expression stern and commanding, every inch the powerful leader he had hinted at being. But it was the name engraved on a small plate that destroyed her completely. Kale Thornridge, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, Supreme Commander of the Royal Guard. The man she had saved, the man she had nursed back to health, the man she had given her body and her heart to just hours ago, was the Alpha King who had ordered the destruction of her clan. He was the monster responsible for every nightmare that haunted her, for every loss she had endured, for the 5 years of isolation and grief that had defined her existence. Isla's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the floor, the wallet, falling from her nerveless fingers, her mind refusing to process the enormity of this betrayal. She had not only helped her enemy, she had fallen in love with him, had allowed him into her bed and her heart, had believed in the possibility of a future together. The sound of movement from the bed made her look up, and she saw Kale sitting up, his expression changing from sleepy contentment to alarm as he took in her pale face and shaking hands. He saw the wallet on the floor. Between them, saw the royal seal visible in the open leather, and his entire body went rigid with understanding. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke, the terrible truth hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. Then Kale tried to speak, tried to explain, but Isla cut him off with a sound that was half laugh and half sob, a broken noise that conveyed the depths of her pain and fury. She demanded to know if he had known who she was, if this had all been some elaborate game or trap. Kale swore he hadn't, swore that he had come to these mountains following reports of a healer helping renegade wolves, that he had intended to investigate, and if necessary eliminate a potential threat to his kingdom's stability, but that he had never known she was a survivor of the clan his forces had destroyed 5 years ago. He explained that he had been ambushed by silver-wielding attackers on his way here, that the storm and his injuries had left him vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. His words tumbled out in a desperate rush, trying to make her understand, trying to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But Isla wasn't ready to hear explanations or excuses. She asked him directly if he had ordered the attack on her clan, if he had commanded his soldiers to burn their homes and slaughter everyone they found. Cale's face went gray as he nodded slowly, admitting that yes, he had given that order, though he claimed it had been based on intelligence from his council, information that suggested her clan was harboring dangerous rebels and planning an uprising that would destabilize the entire region. He described receiving reports of weapons stockpiling and secret meetings, of threats against the crown and plans for assassination, all of which had painted her people as dangerous traitors who needed to be eliminated swiftly and completely. Isla listened to his justifications with growing horror and rage. She told him about the reality of that night, about families sleeping peacefully when the attack came, about children who had been cut down while trying to flee, about healers and craftspeople, and farmers who had no interest in rebellion or politics being massacred in their beds. She described hiding in a cellar while her parents and siblings died above her, listening to their screams and being unable to help, emerging hours later to find her entire world reduced to ash and blood. She made him understand exactly what his order had cost, exactly what had been destroyed in the name of protecting his kingdom from a threat that had never actually existed. Cale's face reflected growing devastation as he listened to her words, as the propaganda and intelligence reports he had relied on were stripped away to reveal the ugly truth of what had been done in his name. He tried to tell her that he had been deceived, that his chief advisor had apparently manipulated the information to serve his own purposes, but Isla cut him off with bitter anger. She pointed out that he had never questioned the intelligence, never sent scouts to verify the claims, never considered that there might be another way to handle a potential threat besides wholesale slaughter. He had trusted his council blindly and signed a death warrant for innocent people, and no amount of regret or apology could change that fundamental failure. Their argument grew more heated, voices rising as pain and betrayal and guilt clashed in the small cabin. Cale admitted he had made a terrible mistake, that he would regret that order for the rest of his life, but he tried to explain the impossible position of leadership, the constant pressure to act decisively to protect the many, even when the cost to the few was devastating. Isla refused to accept that explanation, refused to let him hide behind duty and difficult choices when the result had been the death of everyone she loved. She told him that true leadership required questioning, required verification, required having the courage to resist pressure and demand proof before taking irreversible action. In the midst of their confrontation, Cale suddenly went very still, his expression shifting from defensive anger to dawning horror. He started talking about his chief advisor, a man named Aldrich, who had been pushing for aggressive action against potential threats for years, who had always had convenient intelligence reports to support his recommendations, who had been consolidating power within the council while Cale focused on external threats. He described how Aldrich had been particularly insistent about the clan elimination, how he had presented it as urgent and time-sensitive, how he had discouraged any delay or investigation that might have revealed the truth. As Cale spoke, pieces began to fall into place, a conspiracy taking shape that was even more sinister than simple misinformation. Isla listened despite her anger, her healer's mind recognizing patterns in what Cale was describing. She remembered that her clan's bloodline had been particularly strong in healing magic, that her grandmother had been researching ways to detect and counter dark magic, that there had been whispers in the weeks before the attack of someone asking questions about their family's abilities. She shared these memories with Cale, and together they began to construct a picture of betrayal that went far deeper than either had imagined. What if Aldrich had orchestrated the entire thing, had fabricated the intelligence reports specifically to eliminate a bloodline that posed a threat to his own magical practices, had used Cale's authority to commit murder while keeping his own hands clean. The realization didn't erase the pain or absolve Cale of responsibility, but it shifted something between them. They were both victims of the same conspiracy, both manipulated by someone they had trusted, both living with the consequences of Aldrich's ambition and cruelty. Cale shared that there had been other incidents over the years, other clans or groups that had been eliminated based on Aldrich's intelligence, other situations where the evidence had seemed solid at the time, but had never been independently verified. He described a pattern of consolidation, of removing anyone who might challenge Aldrich's growing influence, of isolating Cale from sources of information that might contradict the narrative being fed to him. As they talked through the night, the dynamic between them shifted again. The intimacy of shared pain replaced the earlier intimacy of desire, creating a different kind of bond forged in truth and trauma. Isla found herself looking at Cale, not just as the monster who had destroyed her life, but as a complex person who had been manipulated and used, who carried his own burden of guilt and grief for the atrocities committed in his name. She saw the weight of his responsibility, the way it bowed his shoulders and haunted his eyes, and recognized in him a genuine desire for redemption, even if she wasn't yet ready to offer forgiveness. Cale asked what she needed from him, what he could possibly do to make amends for something so terrible. Isla's response was immediate and clear. She wanted justice, wanted the truth exposed, wanted Aldrich held accountable for his crimes, and the other potential victims warned before more bloodshed could occur. But more than that, she wanted systemic change in how the Northern Kingdom operated, wanted checks and balances that would prevent one advisor from wielding so much unchallenged power, wanted a commitment to verification and investigation before action. She wanted Cale to transform his leadership from reactive violence to thoughtful justice, to build something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. It was an enormous ask, requiring Cale to challenge his entire council, to admit to his people that he had been deceived and had made catastrophic mistakes, to rebuild the foundations of his kingdom's governance. But as Isla laid out her vision, she saw something ignite in his eyes, a determination that went beyond simple penance. He recognized that she was offering him a path forward, a way to channel his guilt into meaningful change, a chance to prevent future atrocities while honoring the memory of those who had already been lost. He agreed to everything she asked, swearing oaths that bound him magically as well as personally, accepting her terms without negotiation or compromise. But Isla also made something clear to him. Whatever connection existed between them, whatever bond they had discovered, could not be explored or acted upon until after justice had been served and changes had been implemented. She could not be with him, could not accept him as a mate or partner, while the blood of her family remained unavenged and the system that had killed them remained unchanged. If he truly cared for her, if the mate bond was real and not just convenient attraction, then he would prove it through action rather than words, through transformation rather than apology. She was giving him a chance to earn what could never simply be given, and the choice of whether to take it was entirely his. Cale accepted her conditions without hesitation, understanding that trust once shattered could only be rebuilt through consistent demonstration over time. They spent the remaining hours before dawn planning their strategy, combining Isla's knowledge of Aldrich's interest in her clan with Cale's understanding of council politics and kingdom power structures. They identified potential allies within the court, people who had seemed uncomfortable with some of Aldrich's more aggressive recommendations, who might be willing to support reform if presented with evidence of corruption. They discussed how to gather proof of Aldrich's manipulations without alerting him to their suspicions, how to protect potential future targets while building their case. As the sun rose, Cale prepared to return to his kingdom. His injuries healed enough for travel, though Isla cautioned him to be careful not to overexert himself. They stood together at her cabin door, the morning light painting everything in shades of gold and promise. The mate bond hummed between them, acknowledged now but not acted upon, a potential future that depended entirely on whether Cale could become the leader Isla needed him to be. He promised to send her regular updates, to keep her informed of every step he took toward justice and reform, to prove through his actions that her faith in his capacity for change was not misplaced. Isla watched him disappear into the forest, her heart simultaneously breaking and hoping in equal measure. She had sent away the man who had destroyed her world, but she had also sent away the man who might rebuild it into something better. The weeks that followed were agonizing, filled with doubt and fear and desperate hope. She received messages through trusted channels, reports of Cale's careful maneuvering within his council, of his quiet investigation into Aldrich's activities, of his building coalition among those tired of constant conflict and suspicious of the chief advisor's motives. The breaking point came when Cale discovered evidence that Aldrich had been practicing forbidden dark magic, using the life force of those killed in the various eliminations to enhance his own power and extend his lifespan. The proof was irrefutable. Gathered through painstaking investigation and verified by multiple independent sources, Cale called a full council meeting and publicly presented the evidence, stripping Aldrich of his position and placing him under arrest for crimes against the kingdom and its people. The revelation sent shockwaves through the court, forcing a reckoning with years of unquestioned violence and manipulation. But Cale didn't stop there. He used the crisis as an opportunity to implement sweeping reforms, establishing independent verification requirements for all intelligence reports, creating oversight committees with real authority to question and challenge proposed actions, instituting mandatory investigation periods before any military action could be authorized. He publicly admitted his role in the massacre of Isla's clan, taking full responsibility even while explaining the deception that had led to it, and he established a fund to support survivors and descendants of all the groups that had been wrongly targeted over the years. Most significantly, Cale announced that he was dissolving the old council system entirely and creating a new governance structure that included representatives from all major clans and territories, ensuring that no single advisor could ever again wield unchallenged influence. He took the political risk of empowering potential rivals and critics, understanding that true security came not from concentrated power, but from distributed accountability. The changes were radical and controversial, meeting resistance from traditionalists who saw them as weakness. But Cale pushed them through with the same determination he had once used to pursue military solutions. Through it all, he sent Isla detailed reports, sharing both his victories and his struggles, admitting when he faced setbacks or made mistakes. He never pressed her for reconciliation or acknowledgement, never demanded recognition for the changes he was implementing. He simply did the work, day after day, proving through consistent action that his commitment to transformation was genuine and lasting. Isla read every message, watched from her mountain sanctuary as Cale dismantled the system that had destroyed her family and built something new in its place. And slowly, gradually, she began to believe that redemption might actually be possible. 6 months after he left her cabin, Cale returned to the mountains. He came alone, without guards or ceremony, climbing the familiar path to Isla's door with a humility that was entirely new. She had known he was coming, had felt the pull of the mate bond growing stronger as he approached, and she met him outside with her heart in her throat, and hope finally outweighing fear. They stood facing each other in the clearing before her cabin, and Cale told her about everything he had accomplished, about the trials he had overseen for Aldrich and his collaborators, about the new council's first successful mediation of a clan dispute without violence, about the beginning of healing in a kingdom that had been built on aggression and fear. Isla listened to him describe the transformation of his leadership, hearing in his words a man who had learned to question himself, to seek counsel from multiple sources, to value prevention and communication over punishment and force. She saw in his eyes the weight he still carried for past failures, understood that he would never forget or fully forgive himself for the massacre he had ordered, and she recognized that this ongoing consciousness of his capacity for terrible mistakes was exactly what would prevent him from repeating them. He had become not perfect, but aware, not absolved, but committed to doing better, and that was all she had ever asked for. When Cale finished speaking, he asked her directly if she could ever see a future with him, if the mate bond they both felt could ever become something real and lasting, despite the blood-soaked history between them. Isla's answer was, honest, and complex. She told him that she could never forget what had happened, could never stop mourning the family she had lost, but that she had also witnessed his genuine transformation and believed in his commitment to preventing future atrocities. She explained that loving him would always be complicated, would always carry echoes of pain alongside joy, but that she had learned over these months that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about building a better future from its ruins. She stepped forward and took his hands, feeling the mate bond flare between them with an intensity that made them both gasp. She told him yes, she would accept him as her mate, would stand beside him as he continued the work of transformation, would help him build a kingdom based on justice and compassion, rather than fear and violence. But she also made clear that this was not a fairy tale ending where love conquered all and everyone lived happily ever after, without effort or struggle. It was the beginning of something difficult and necessary, a partnership that would require constant work and communication, a commitment to holding each other accountable while supporting each other's growth. Cale accepted her terms with gratitude and relief, understanding that what she offered was more valuable than easy absolution. They sealed their bond that night, making love with a depth of emotion that transcended their first joining, claiming each other with full knowledge of all the complications and challenges that lay ahead. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, they talked about the future they would build together, about Isla coming out of isolation to serve as his chief advisor and the kingdom's head healer, about using her bloodline's gifts to train a new generation in magic that could detect and counter corruption, about creating a network of accountability that would make another Aldrich impossible. The epilogue of their story unfolded over years rather than moments. Isla never fully left her mountain cabin, maintaining it as a sanctuary and reminder of where she had been and what she had survived. But she split her time between that solitude and the capital city where she stood beside Cale as his mate and partner in leadership. Together they transformed the Northern Kingdom from a place of fear and violence into a model of justice and collaborative governance. They faced opposition and setbacks, dealt with those who preferred the old ways and resented the changes, but they persevered with the same determination that had brought them together in the first place. They honored the memory of Isla's clan by establishing a festival of remembrance each year, ensuring that the tragedy was never forgotten and the lessons it taught were passed down to future generations. They created scholarships for young healers in her family's name, invested in programs that supported survivors of violence, built monuments that spoke truth about past atrocities rather than hiding them behind propaganda or justification. The work was never finished, never complete, but that was the point. True transformation was not a destination, but an ongoing commitment, a choice made new each day to build something better than what had come before. Their relationship remained complex, marked by deep love, but also by honest acknowledgement of the pain that had brought them together. There were nights when Isla woke from nightmares of her clan's destruction and needed space from Cale, moments when the weight of what he had done felt too heavy to bear, despite all the changes he had made. And there were times when Cale struggled under the burden of his guilt, when he questioned whether he deserved the happiness he had found, when the ghosts of his past mistakes haunted him too thoroughly to accept comfort. But they worked through these difficulties together, learning to hold space for each other's pain, while also celebrating each other's growth. Understanding that healing was not linear, and forgiveness was not a single act, but an ongoing choice. If you've made it this far in their journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe in second chances for those who have committed terrible acts? Can love really transform someone? Or does it just provide motivation for change they were already capable of? And would you have made the same choice Isla did, giving Cale a chance to prove himself, rather than turning him away? Drop your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this story of redemption and transformation, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance tales that explore the complex intersections of love, justice, and forgiveness. Years later, when people asked Isla how she could be with the man who had ordered her family's death, she always gave the same answer. She explained that Cale was not the same person who had signed that order, that he had done the difficult work of genuine transformation, that he proved every day through his actions and choices that he had learned from his mistakes and was committed to preventing similar tragedies. She acknowledged that her path was not the right one for everyone, that some betrayals were too deep for reconciliation. But for her, the combination of the mate bond and Cale's demonstrated commitment to change had made a future together possible, if not simple. And when people asked Cale how he lived with the guilt of what he had done, he was equally honest. He explained that he didn't live with it so much as carried it, that the weight of his past mistakes was something he would bear for the rest of his life, that he had no interest in being absolved or forgiven in a way that would allow him to forget. He described his guilt as a compass that kept him oriented toward justice, a reminder of what happened when power went unchecked and leaders failed to question their advisors or verify their information. He said that Isla's love was not a reward for his redemption, but rather the greatest responsibility he had ever accepted, a daily reminder of what he was working to protect and why the transformation of his kingdom mattered so profoundly. Together, they represented a different kind of love story than the ones typically told in supernatural romance. Theirs was not about fated mates overcoming external obstacles to be together, but about two people choosing each other despite internal conflicts and complicated history, about building something meaningful from the ruins of tragedy. They showed that redemption was possible, but never easy, that love could survive even the deepest betrayals, if both parties were willing to do the difficult work of healing and transformation. And they proved that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance against systems of violence and oppression was to transform those systems from within, to take positions of power and use them to build something fundamentally different and better. The story of the healer who sheltered the Alpha King during a storm became legend in the Northern Kingdom, told and retold as an example of how mercy and justice could coexist, how love could inspire profound change without excusing terrible actions, how even the darkest past could give rise to brighter futures if people were willing to commit to the hard work of transformation. And at the heart of that legend were Isla and Cale, two people who had every reason to be enemies, but who chose instead to become partners in building a world where the tragedies of the past would never be repeated, where power would be checked by accountability, and where love would be measured not in pretty words, but in consistent action toward justice and healing.